And the Mishnah begins. Okay, Tom. The Mishnah talks about what was done in the base of Migdash. As you know, there was a Talmud, a carbon brought in the morning, called a carbon Talmud, and one carbon Talmud with a sheep offering that was offered in the afternoon. And in between those sheep offerings, everybody who had a private carbon would bring up that private carbon into the base of Migdash. Prior to the carbon in the morning, or after the carbon in the afternoon, you are not allowed to bring your own private carbon. So that's the point. The other point is that the only exception to the rule is carbon Pesach. Carbon Pesach, after they brought the carbon in the afternoon, the carbon Tamid in the afternoon, then everybody brought their own carbon Pesach. So the Mishnah begins. The Mishnah says, Tamid, the afternoon carbon Tamid, Nishchat was shechted, b'shmoina u'mechitza, on the 8.5 hour into the day. So let's assume the day goes from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., sunrise to sunset. So on a typical day, a typical Tuesday afternoon, the carbon Talmud was slaughtered at 2:30 in the afternoon. Now, it would vikare b'tisho mechza, and they actually brought the insides up onto the mizbeach at 9.5 hours, so at 3:30. So by the time they got the carbon to be prepared after it was slaughtered to be brought and burnt on the mizbeach, that was 9.5 hours. So 2:30 it was brought, 3:30 they burnt the carbon. Okay, that was the end of the day, basically in the base of Migdash. After that, they did preparing of the neiros, nesachim, little ketores, but that was the base of Migdash closed early. I mean, like by 5 o'clock it was over. But Arvi Pesachim, says the Mishnah, on Erev Pesach, nishchat b'sheva mechza. The carbon Pesach was slaughtered. The carbon Tamid was slaughtered b'seva umechza. Sheva umechza means 7.5 hours, 1:30. Why did they shech the carbon Tamid early? Very simple, because everybody had to bring their own carbon Pesach after the afternoon carbon Tamid. It was not supposed to be brought before, so therefore they moved up the carbon Tamid to Sheva mechza. The Karev b'shmeina mechza, and they Makriv. It took 1 hour till they finally brought up the insides onto the mizbeach, the carbon Tamid on the mizbeach, 8.5 hours. Now the Mishnah says a key word over here: bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbos. And no matter when Erev Pesach falls out, if Erev Pesach is on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Erev Pesach is on a Shabbos, that means Saturday night is your Seder night. The carbon Tamid was brought 1:30. Now I point out to you, they slaughtered the carbon Pesach is doiche Shabbos. So you're allowed to slaughter, everybody slaughtered their carbon Pesach if Erev Pesach came out on Shabbos. But they weren't allowed to roast it till Motzei Shabbos. So the Mishnah says that even when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, the carbon Tamid in the base of Migdash was brought Sheva Mechza. Now the Mishnah tells you the exception to the rule. Another exception. Chol Erev Pesach liyas be'erev Shabbos. So let's say Erev Pesach fell out on Friday. Now here, they needed to move everything up very, very much because they had to move the carbon Tamid up a lot because they needed people to have time not only to shech the carbon Pesach, but to roast the carbon Pesach. Because come sundown, it's Shabbos already. You can't roast a carbon Pesach. So therefore, when Erev Pesach falls out on Friday, nishchat b'sheish mechza, the carbon Pesach was shech, the carbon Tamid was slaughtered at 6.5. The carbon b'sheva mechza, and an hour later it was brought up by sheva mechza, 7.5 hours into the day, and then ba Pesach acharov, and then everybody brought their own carbon Pesach, and they roasted it while it was still day. So let's just review the Mishnah. This is very simple. Look at this Mishnah. And a Tamid, the carbon Tamid, on a regular weekday, it was slaughtered 8.5 hours. Erev Pesach during the weekdays, if Erev Pesach falls out during the weekdays, or on the other end, Erev Pesach is on Shabbos, that means Motzei Shabbos is your Seder, then the carbon Tamid was slaughtered 7.5 hours. Very important, 7.5 hours. When Erev Pesach was on a Friday, Then the carbon tamid was moved up to 6.5 hours. That's when they brought the carbon tamid. So the Gemara continues. How do I know on a typical day, is there a din in the Torah that tells you that the carbon tamid, the afternoon, was slaughtered at the 8.5 hour mark? Amar Rabbi Shuba Levi, the Amakra, because I have a pasuk. As the kevis echad tasa b'boker. The Torah says make one sheep in the morning. As a kevis hasheni, and the second sheep tasa bein rabayim. Do it in the afternoon. So the Torah is telling you in the afternoon. Well, let's see, what's the afternoon? From 12 to 6 p.m., okay? And therefore, there's 6 hours in between the afternoons, between the afternoon and the evening. So what the Torah is basically telling you is chalkeu lebein shnei aravim. Put it in between the two afternoons, in between 12 and 6. That means, beishoy semechza lakan. You put 2.5 hours for one side. That means from 12 to 2:30 on one side. And from 3:30 to 6 on the other side. And then you leave an hour smack in the middle, and you smack in the middle right then between 2:30 and 3:30. That's when you do the carbon tamid. So here, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi brought a biblical source that says that you should be makar of the carbon tamid at 8.5 hours. That's when you start being makar of the carbon tamid, right in the middle of almost the middle of the afternoon, where the carbon tamid will be brought in the middle of the afternoon, between 12 and 6. So that's the source. It's a biblical source. So the Gemara doesn't like that. Masiv Rava. Rava asked the question, if it's a biblical source, what would give the Chachamim right on Erev Pesach to move it up? Masiv Rava. In our Mishnah it says, Ba'arvei Pesachim, Nishchat, they shechted, B'shevel Mechta. B'karei, B'shmeina Mechta. On Erev Pesach, on a typical Erev Pesach, they actually moved up and brought the carbon tamid at the 7.5 hour. Bein B'chol, whether it was a weekday Erev Pesach, Bein B'Shabbos, when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos. Isal Kadaitach, if you thought, B'shmeina Mechta D'Oraisa, that you have to bring it in the 8.5 hour, and that's min haTorah, right? Then heicha makdimile. What would give Chachamim the right to bump it up early just because you need more time? The Torah says do it by 8.5 hours, so you can't move it up earlier. So Elam Rava says there is no biblical source. Really, the real mitzvah technically can be done at 12 o'clock or 12:30. Mitzvah say the tamid, the original tamid in the afternoon, you could not do it erev. As soon as it starts, the shade moves off the center, so it's shady in the west, like the sun is beginning to tilt towards the west. Then the mitzvah is to bring the carbon tamid. That in the Minatorah, you can bring it at that time. My timer, Domakra, Bein Arbayim. As soon as the sun starts moving to the west, you could already bring the carbon tamid. So you can ask me a question, if I can already bring the carbon tamid at 12:30, 6.5 hours, or even 12, so why did they push it off to 2:30 every day? The answer is because people had to bring private carbonos, and they had to bring it before you bring it the carbon tamid in the afternoon. A typical person, people came with their own obligations. They wanted to be makar of it before the tamid shebein abayim. So hilkach, therefore, b'shari Moshe Shana, every other day of the year, the ikin adarmin adavis, you have carbonas, private carbonas that people are bringing. The Rachmana Amar Aleh Hachel Be'Ashlamim. The Torah says that after you bring the tamid shel shacher, then you bring your private carbon, and then after you bring the carbon tamid shel bein arbayim, you can't bring anything afterwards. The Amamar Aleh Hashlim Kol HaKarbonos Kulam. After you bring the carbon tamid shel shachra, then you're supposed to stop bringing. That's it. Then you can't bring any more your private carbon after they brought the carbon tamid shel bein arbayim. Therefore, that's why every year, every day of the year, they pushed off bringing the carbon tamid 2.5 hours, 2 hours later, and they brought the carbon tamid 8.5 hours by 2:30. Technically, again, They could have brought it by 12:30. They pushed it off 2 hours to give people time to bring their own karbanas. But that was every single day. The Ika Pesach Achar, the Erev Pesach, people are bringing their own carbon Pesach after the carbon shel Tamid shel Bein Rabayim. Then they moved up the time to bring the carbon Tamid of the afternoon, and they did it by Sheva Umechitza by 1:30, by 7.5 hours. But then Chol Erev Pesach Lias Erev Shabbos, then you have a double problem. Erev Pesach, which is on a Friday, that means you could have to roast it before the onset of Shabbos. The economics liyosei deloy dachi Shabbos. There's the roasting of the meat, which is not pushing away Shabbos. You can't roast it already before your Seder. You have to have it all done already on Friday afternoon. So therefore, then they put it on the Din Torah, the earliest possible time that you can bring it, which is on the 6.5 hour, which is 12:30. So that's how it all sets up, lines very nicely, the different times that you brought the carbon tamid in order to accommodate situations of Erev Pesach. Now, the Gemara brings, this is a typical Gemara. You need to see it inside, where the Gemara says a cryptic statement and has 3 different ways to interpret it. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Ki sidurei b'chayil, the way it was organized during the weekday, kach sidurei b'Shabbos. That's how on Shabbos it was organized. What's he? Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva says, Ki sidurei be'erev Pesach. On Shabbos, it was like it was organized on Erev Pesach. So this is very cryptic brisa, and it's not clear what the machlok is between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. What are they talking about? So the first interpretation is Abaya. Abaya says, "My kama, Amar Abaya, hachi kama." This is what Rabbi Shmuel is saying. Ki sidure b'chol be'erev Pesach. The way it was set up, organized during the weekdays on Erev Pesach. Now let me remind you, on Erev Pesach on a Tuesday, when did they bring the carbon tamid? Well, let's check out Chev. At Erev Pesach B'chol at 7.5 hours. So at 7.5 hours, that's that kach Siduri b'Shabbos be'erev Pesach. Even when Erev Pesach comes out on Shabbos, that means Motzei Shabbos is your Seder. They also brought the carbon Pesach at 7.5 hours, Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Now, technically, they could bring it even earlier, because really on a Shabbos, there's no reason why to push off bringing the carbon Pesach, because the carbon Tamid, because nobody's bringing private the donations on Shabbos. Nadarim and Nadavis are not brought on Shabbos. Nevertheless, still, an Erev Pesach, whether the Erev Pesach comes out on a Tuesday or a weekday, or whether Erev Pesach comes out on Shabbos, it was always brought at 7.5 hours. So this, the Gemara is going to say, who's going to be the author of our Mishnah? That's going to be Rabbi Shmuel. Comes along Rabbi Akiva, and he says, Ki siduri be'erev Pesach shcholias be'erev Shabbos, kach siduri b'Shabbos. On, like the way it was set up at Erev Pesach, shchol lios be'erev Shabbos, when the way it was organized in Erev Pesach that fell out on Friday, which we said was by 6.5 hours, kach siduri b'Shabbos. So on a regular Shabbos, they already brought the carbon. They already brought the carbon tamid. That means on a regular Shabbos, they brought the carbon tamid 12:30 in the afternoon. Okay, that's what Rabbi Akiva says. Umas nisan. Our Mishnah, Dektani bein b'choil bein b'Shabbos. Our Mishnah that says whether Erev Pesach comes out on a weekday or on Shabbos, you bring it at 7.5 hours. Rabbi Shmuel, it's Rabbi Yishmael. So if we can see it inside over here, you could see it that Rabbi Yishmael, according to Abaya, Rabbi Yishmael says that Erev Pesach that comes out on Shabbos, you brought it on 7.5 hours. You brought it at 7.5 hours, but Rabbi Akiva says an Erev Pesach that falls on Shabbos, you brought it by 6.5 hours. So Erev Pesach on Shabbos has the same din as Erev Pesach on a Friday, according to Rabbi Akiva. which you would actually bring it by 6.5 hours. So our Mishnah aligns itself up with Rabbi Shmuel. That's Abaya's interpretation. So now the question is, the Gemara just explains, Mamai Kami Palgi, what is Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel arguing? Why does Rabbi Akiva hold that on Erev Pesach, which is on a Shabbos, you could bring the carbon tamid at 6.5 hours? Rabbi Shmuel says you have to push it off to 7.5 hours. The answer is, can you does the musaf have to come before the bozichen? What is bozichen? So let's look at the picture of a shulchan. This was the shulchan in the Beis HaMikdash. This is the showbread, the lechem aponim. They would be makriv, these two spoons, so to speak, of frankincense on the mizbeach every Shabbos, and then they would distribute the loaves to the kahanim to eat on Shabbos. That was one of the avodas on Shabbos, and then they would put new loaves and put new bazichim. So that's the bazichim. So according to machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel, is this thing of bazichim, being brought onto the mizbeach, does it precede the carbon musaf? Rabbi Shmuel sava musafin koyim bazichim. You first have to do the Shabbos musaf, and then you did the bazichim, and then you distributed the lechem upon it. So avad lehul musafin b'sheish. That's when a typical Shabbos they brought the musaf in the 6th hour, ubazichen b'sheva, and the bazichen is on the 7th hour. But avad late the tamid b'sheva machza. And then they did the carbon tamid by the 7.5 hour, because they had to do the musaf first and then the bazichim. But Rabbi Akiva says no, they have time. They could push up on Erev Pesach, which is Shabbos. They could push it up an hour. Why? Because the bazichim you could even do it at 11 o'clock in the morning. Rabbi Akiva sava bazichim koydmin l'musafim. The bazichim came before the musaf. Bazichim b'chamish. They did the bazichim, let's say, at 11 o'clock. Umusafim b'sheif, and then the musaf was at 6. And then they did the tamid by the 6.5 hour. That's why Rabbi Akiva holds that on Erev Pesach that comes out on Shabbos, there was plenty of time. They moved it up doing the carbon tamid at 6.5 hours. Just like when Erev Pesach falls out on Friday, to give a lot of time for people to bring the carbon Pesach. So basically, the machlokes between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva is what happens with Erev Pesach that falls out on Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva says 7.5 hours. Rabbi Shmuel says 7.5 hours. Rabbi Akiva says 6.5 hours. Our Mishnah aligns itself up with Rabbi Shmuel. Maskif lo Rava. Rava says, if that's the way you're interpreting the Brisa, that means you have to say that Rabbi Akiva says, Kisidure be'erev Pesach, he means Kisidure be'erev Pesach shechol liyas be'erev Shabbos. You have to put a lot of words into Rabbi Akiva. But Rabbi Akiva never said that. Raskiv lo Rava, midi Rabbi Akiva Kisidure be'erev Pesach shechol liyas be'Shabbos katani. Did Rabbi Akiva say those words? That it's organized like Erev Pesach that falls out in Erev Shabbos? He wrote Kisidre be'erev Pesach stomach katani. Rabbi Akiva, all he said was it's organized like a typical Erev Pesach. It doesn't say what you want to say in the Brisa. So Rabbi Rava rejects Abaya's interpretation of the Brisa. Ela Amar Rava says, Hachi Kama. This is what the Brisa means to say. Kisidra b'chol de alma, the way it was organized on a regular weekday, when did they bring the carbon tamid? A regular, typical Tuesday afternoon, not Erev Pesach. It was brought at the 8.5 hour. Kach sidre b'Shabbos b'Erev Pesach. When Shabbos is Erev Pesach, on Shabbos, they also brought the carbon tamid way in the afternoon by 8.5 hours. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. In fact, they pushed it off very, very late to bring the carbon tamid. And there's good reason for that. And it's a very interesting reason, which the Gemara is going to explain in a moment. Because, I'll tell it to you, because they didn't want you to bring the carbon Pesach too early on Shabbos because they had no refrigerators. And therefore, and you're not roasting it on Shabbos, so it may heat up the the meat might get heaten up and it'll rot. That's why you pushed off bringing the Carbon Pesach till way later on in the afternoon, till more closer to when Shabbos ends. Rabbi Kiva argues, no, an Erev Pesach that falls out in Shabbos is like a typical Erev Pesach. That Carbon Tamid was organized, considering Erev Pesach, that it was organized that they brought the Carbon Tamid at 7.5 hours. Our Mishnah, according to way Rav's interpretation of the Machlokes, that says whether it's the weekdays, whether it's Shabbos, you always brought on Erev Pesach the Carbon Tamid at 7.5 hours. Rabbi Akiva. So the way Rav learns, our Mishnah, author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva. What is the argument? Why would Rabbi Shmuel say on Erev Pesach, that's on Shabbos, you should make the Carbon Tamid way in the afternoon? Not that we don't want people to bring Carbon Pesach early. Why not? So Rashi, the Gemara says, "B'michma bisra carbon mipalgi." It's the heating up the flesh. That's what they're arguing. Rabbi Yishmael Savar, if you allowed people to bring the Carbon Pesach very early on Shabbos, chashinin lemichma bisra, the meat is going to get heaten up and it's going to rot the meat. You know, you won't have meat by your Seder, because you brought the Carbon Pesach way early in the afternoon on Shabbos, and there's no refrigeration, and you're not roasting it, so the meat could go spoil. That's why Rabbi Shmuel said, make the Carbon Tamid later on Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva said, we're not concerned whether the meat will get heaten up and spoiled. So even on Shabbos, Rabbi Akiva says you could bring the Carbon Tamid like a regular Erev Pesach, just 1 hour early, 7.5 hours. We go to Nuches Amid Beis. So the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Akiva, that he has no problem with the meat going spoiled. So why didn't Rabbi Akiva say that you could bring the Carbon Tamid on Shabbos at 6.5 hours? Let's make the Carbon Tamid at 6.5 hours. Give even more time to people to bring the Carbon Pesach. And says the Gemara, Kesavar, Rabbi Akiva still needs time for the Bezichin. Kesava Musaf and Kaidun Zichin. Rabbi Akiva holds that the Musaf of Shabbos has to be brought before the Bezichin. Avad Lula Musaf and B'Sheish. They do the Musaf at the 6th hour. Ubazichin B'Sheva, and the Bezichin in the 7th hour. And then V'Avad Leila Tamid B'Sheva Mechza. And then they brought the Carbon Tamid B'Sheva Mechza. And then afterwards, people brought their Carbon Pesach. So that's why that's why Rabbi Akiva held that no Erev Pesach that's on Shabbos, the Carbon Tamid was brought at 7.5 hours. Now, Maskif lo Rabba Bar Ula. Rabba Bar Ula does not like the interpretation that we said. That is the Machlokes. Because if you look, because according to Rabbi Akiva, if you look back, Rabbi Shmuel said, Ki sidurei bechol kach sidurei b'Shabbos. He never mentioned anything about Erev Pesach and it's Erev Pesach. It's talking about a regular weekday. So, Maskif la Rabba Bar Ula mide kisudura bekal chach sidre b'Shabbos Erev Pesach. Did Rabbi Shmuel use these words that the way it was organized on a weekday at 8.5 hours? That's the way it was organized on a Shabbos on Erev Pesach. On a Shabbos and Erev Pesach that you brought in an Erev that you brought in 8.5 hours. It never says the word Erev Pesach. Tani. Kach sidre b'Shabbos Amakatani. Rabbi Shmuel just said the way it was organized in the weekdays, that's the way it was organized on Shabbos. Rabbi Shmuel made no mention that he's talking about Erev Pesach. So what is the Machlokes? Ella Amar Rabba Bar Ula Hachikatani. This is the Machlokes. It has nothing to do with Erev Pesach. Kisidre Bechol da Alma, the way it was organized on a regular weekday. That means they brought the Carbon Tamid and the regular weekday at 8.5 hours. Kach Sidra b'Shabbos the Alma. On a regular Shabbos, it was also brought at 8.5 hours. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva argues that Kisidra b'Erev Pesach the Alma. On Shabbos, they didn't bring it like a regular weekday. They moved it up earlier because nobody was bringing the Doros and the Davis on Shabbos. Kach Sidra b'Shabbos the Alma. On a regular Shabbos, it was like a regular Erev Pesach that they brought it up at the 7.5 hour. So that's exactly this point I was trying to tell you over here, that according to the way we're learning Pshat now in the Machlokes, they're dealing with what right over here, this point over here. when did they bring the carbon tamid on a regular Shabbos? According to Rabbi Shmuel, on a regular Shabbos, just like on a regular weekday, they brought it at 8.5 hours. So on a regular Shabbos, it was also brought 8.5 hours. That is Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva holds, no, you brought it at 7.5 hours. At 7.5 hours, okay? So that's Rabbi Akiva. So now, what is the machlekes? Why does Rabbi Shmuel say keep it like Shabbos like a regular day, and Rabbi Akiva says not? But my coming palgi, b'gzeres the darim davis coming palgi. Rabbi Shmuel saw the gazarin Shabbos al dechoya. Rabbi Shmuel holds that if you allow Shabbos to move up early, people will move up the weekday early, and then people won't have time to bring the darim and the davis. So that's why they made it uniform. Weekday is 8.5, Shabbos is 8.5. Rabbi Akiva Sava loy gazrinan. We're not geyser. Shabbos, no one's bringing the darim and davis. Move it up early. So the Gemara says, "Loy gazrina never the b'vav mechza." If Rabbi Akiva holds that there's no gzeira, so why didn't they do Shabbos even by 6.5 hours? And for the Gemara again, Kesava Musafim Kaidin L'Zichin. Musafim has to come before Bezichin. Musafim B'Sheif. Musafim was by 6. Bezichin B'Zayin. Aved Leit Tamid B'Zayin Umechetza. And then they did the Karm Tamid by 7.5 hours. So on a regular Shabbos, Rabbi Akiva holds that they did it 7.5 hours. And Rabbi Shmuel holds on a regular Shabbos they brought the carbon at 8.5 hours. But they're not talking about Erev Pesach. And Erev Pesach, our Mishnah could even be both Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Now the Gemara just ends off 2 questions, one against Rabbiya and one against Rava, and then the Gemara answers it. Meisvei, I'm going to ask you a question. Tamid kol hashana kula kara kil chasei. The Brisa says that Rabbi Shmuel is talking over here, and he said the Talmud every day of the year they brought it normally according to the halacha nishchat b'shmeina mechza v'kara b'tasa mechza. They shechted it at 8.5 hours and they makrav it in 9.5 hours. Fine. Continues Rabbi Shmuel, and he says ube'era pesach nishchat b'zayin mechza. On Erev Pesach, it's the carbon Pesach was slaughtered in the 7.5 hour of carbon b'chesem mechza. By 8.5 hours. Chol liyos b'Shabbos, if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, k'chol liyos b'sheni b'Shabbos, it's as if Erev Pesach fell out on a Monday. Both. When Erev Pesach falls out on a Monday, we said that the carbon Pesach is that the Talmud is shechted in the 7.5 hour. So also if the Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, the carbon Talmud was shechted in the 7.5 hour. This is very aligns itself up. This opinion of Rabbi Shmuel is the way Rabbiya said Rabbi Shmuel holds. That on Shabbos, on Erev Pesach Shabbos, on Erev Pesach weekday, they both say that Rabbi Shmuel says it's both 7.5 hour. Rabbi Akiva says, Kisidroi be'erev Pesach. Rabbi Akiva says that what Kisidroi be'erev Pesach means the way it's organized in the Erev Pesach that falls out on Erev Shabbos. That means Rabbi Akiva holds that you actually brought, when Erev Pesach fell out on Shabbos, it was as if Erev Pesach fell out on Friday, which they would bring the carbon Pesach at the 6.5 hour. So Bishlama Abaya, the way Abaya interpreted the machlokes between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, Nicha, I can make sense of this brisa. Ela Rava Kasha, according to Rava, how do I make sense of this brisa? It seems that Rabbi Shmuel holds that Erev Pesach that falls out on Shabbos, you bring it in the 7.5 hour. But the way Rabbi Rava learned, if you see over here, the way Rava learned Rabbi Shmuel is Rabbi Shmuel says when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, you bring it in the 8.5 hour. And this brisa seems to say that Rabbi Shmuel holds that you bring it in the 7.5 hour. So Amalach Rava loy temek kol liyos b'sheni b'Shabbos. Don't say that when he said that when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, it's as if it fell out on a Monday. No, it's as if it fell out, not as if Pesach fell out on a Monday. Erev Pesach fell out. It's as if a regular Monday. It means Erev Pesach that falls out on Shabbos is like a regular day, a regular Monday day without Erev Pesach. And just like a regular Monday day, you bring the carbon tamid at the 8.5 hour. So Erev Pesach that falls out on Shabbos is The same idea. You brought it at 8.5 hours. The same way Rabbi Rava said that according to Rabbi Shmuel, you always on Shabbos should bring the carbon tumit later so that you don't have enough. You have a little amount of time to bring your carbon Pesach so you don't spoil it. So he just answered this brisa so it aligned that it's not a question against Rava. Now Mara has a brisa that seems to make sense according to Rava, and it's questioned according to Abaya. The brisa says, Meisavei, Cholias b'Shabbos. If Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, Kisidrei Kol Hashana Kula. It's as if it fell out. It's like the organization of the entire year, which means that Erev Pesach on Shabbos should be like a regular carbon tumid the entire year, which is brought at the 8.5 hour. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Kiva Oimer Kisidroi be'Erev Pesach Alba. It's brought in the 7.5 hour, just like Erev Pesach of a weekday. If Erev Pesach is on a Monday, it's the 7.5 hour. It's Erev Pesach on a Shabbos, it's also the 7.5 hour. So this brisa seems clearly like Rava, that Rabbi Shmuel said that Erev Pesach that falls out on Shabbos, you bring it at the 8th hour. Bishlam Rava Nicha, this makes sense according to Rava. El Abaya Kasha, but according to Abaya, it's questionable. Abaya said no. Lois Teme Kisidra Kol Hashana, Elaime Kisidra Kol Hashanim Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says if everything falls out on, if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, it's as if Erev Pesach fell like another year during the weekday. So it's Kisidrei Kol Hashanim, not like a regular Talmud during the year, but on regular Erev Pesach Talmud during the weekday, which is the 7th hour. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Kiva holds Kisidrei Erev Pesach Cholias Be'er Shabbos. It's like this, the order of Erev Pesach that falls out on Shabbos, and therefore you bring it on 6.5 hour. So let's just make it in a very simple nutshell. Very simple nutshell. On a regular weekday, carbon tumim was brought 8.5 hours. On Erev Pesach during the weekdays, it's brought in the 7th hours. What happens if Erev Pesach falls out on a Friday? You bring it in the 6.5 hour. If Erev Pesach falls out on a Shabbos, so our Mishnah says it's similar to Erev Pesach falling out in the weekday. So Abaya said this aligns with the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. Erev Pesach falling on Shabbos, you bring it in the 7th hour. According to the Rava learned, this our Mishnah is according to Rabbi Akiva, where Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos. Because according to Rabbi Shmuel, Erev Pesach on Shabbos, you have to actually bring it in the 8.5 hour, which is much later, because I didn't want you to bring the carbon Pesach too early, because you might lead to getting the carbon Pesach brought too early, and people will have not what to do with the meat because they can't refrigerate it and they can't roast it, and it'll come spoiled. So our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Shmuel. Our Mishnah, according to Abaya and Rava, according to Abaya, it's Rabbi Shmuel. According to Rava, it's Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so it ends this Gemara. Let's just do one more piece, and that's it. The Gemara, this is simple. Tana Rabbanan, rabbis taught. Minayin, how do I know? Shlei dava kaidem l'tamid shel shachar. I'm not allowed to bring my own personal carbon before the tamid of the morning. Talmud Laimi, the pasuk says, "V'orach olel ha'oila." After you prepare the wood, the first carbon that's brought in the day is ha'oila, the oilas tamid. The first, the carbon tzibur, carbon tamid. That's the first thing that should be brought up on the mizbeach every day. My Talmuda, how do you see it from the word ha'oila? Amarava, ha'oila stands for oila rishayda. That is the first oila. The first oila is the tamid shel shachar. Umenayin, how do I know that after you bring the afternoon carbon, she'ein dava karav achar tamid shel bein rabbaim? How do I know I don't bring anything after the afternoon carbon? Talmud laima v'iktor lel chelvei hashlamim. After you bring the first oila, then you could bring your personal carbon or shlamim. So after you bring the carbon tamid shel shachar, the Torah says you could bring any shlamim that you want. My Talmuda, Amar Abaya, how do you see it? Alel shlamim. After the carbon tamid in the morning, then you bring shlamims. V'loy al chaverta shlamim, but not after its partner. You can bring shlamim. In other words, the chaverta is the afternoon tamid, and the afternoon tamid you're not allowed to bring a carbon shlamim after that. because the Torah says only after the first Talmud you could bring your personal shlomims. But after the afternoon, you can't bring your personal shlomims. So we see that pretty much the Beis Hamikdash had to close after the second carbon, after the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim. Maskiv La Rava, but maybe the way you're learning that, Abaya, maybe the Torah is telling you that a carbon shlomim I cannot bring after the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim. But ha'oila is nakriv. But if I have a personal oila, maybe I could be makriv after the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim. So how do you see from that pasuk is that everything you can't bring, no carbon, no personal carbon after the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim. Allah Amar Rava said, you darshan it from this way, ha-shalomim. That means after the Torah says, oleha, after you bring the carbon Talmud Shel Shachar, hashleim, complete, kol al-karbanos kulam. All your personal karbanos should be taken care of after the carbon Talmud Shel Shachar. So it's mashma from that. So you that implies only after the Talmud Shel Shachar you could bring your personal karbanos. After the Talmud Shel Ben Arbayim, the Beis Hamikdash has to close and no more personal karbanos. So we learned a lot today about how the Talmud was brought on a typical day, and that sets it up so we can understand the order of the day of Erev Pesach when everybody had to bring their own personal carbon Pesach.